Ah, welcome. I'm so glad you could join us. Please come in. Your presence honors us. Here at the Mr. Homemaker podcast, we share our stories and challenges, collect the best expert advice, and offer one another support as we learn to manage our households. Your perspective and contributions will be very valuable. And just in time, today's discussion is about to begin. It is my pleasure to present Mr. Homemaker.
Thank you for joining me as we continue developing a theory of marriage and family life, and strategies that young men can adopt to achieve healthy and fulfilling outcomes for themselves, their wives, and their children. Earlier this season, we identified and discussed the purpose of both marriage and family through the lens of sociology. Then we considered how rapid changes in technology, the economy, and societal values since World War II have been increasingly detrimental to marriages, families, and children in America. This historic narrative is validated by considering the same trends through the lens of economics. As we discussed 2 episodes ago, when society dissolves incentive structures that promote domestic life, the result is a tragedy of the commons, where every economic agent is compelled to become self-sufficient at the expense of developing skills that are essential to being an effective spouse, homemaker, or parent. This kind of policy scheme, which has been in place in America for 50 years, is a form of institutionalized individualism. Through both convention and law, our society has spent half a century making it both easier and more necessary for each person to navigate life alone, unburdened by the constraints imposed by family, but also unaided by the support provided by family. Even for those who have formed families over the last 2 generations, those families have been altered to provide less benefit and impose fewer burdens than family had for any prior generation. While the conditions that created this crisis can be plotted along a timeline over the past 100 years, the ideas that inspire and motivate them are part of a much larger and longer story. To understand and think clearly about the landscape of philosophical paradigms that ebb and flow in competition, we need to step back and consider the whole of human history. How technology has changed the way we live, how competing interests have changed the way we think, and how both our lifestyles and our worldviews have changed our marriages, families, and society for better and for worse. Let me briefly remind you of some key facts and figures related to human history. Human beings began to exist as a species distinct from other great apes 3 million years ago. Until 5,000 years ago, our species existed as hunters and gatherers. So more than 99.8% of our evolution, how our bodies work and how our brains are wired, was determined by the hunter-gatherer existence. Around 3000 BC, humanity shifted from hunting and gathering to agriculture. And along with agriculture, we began to develop large communities, societies, and cultures. We invented writing, organized large-scale long-term projects, and accumulated wealth, which led to social and economic hierarchies. Until 275 years ago, all our social and cultural development was determined by the agricultural way of life. Put another way, for nearly 95% of the time that human beings have had a society, that society was built around an agriculture. It wasn't until the year 1750 only 275 years ago that the Industrial Revolution began. And in the space of less than 200 years, just a few lifetimes, technology dramatically changed the way human beings lived. From the vast majority spending their entire lives close to family and the rural communities their ancestors had resided in for countless generations, to the vast majority uprooting and dispersing themselves in search of jobs in mines, in mills, and in factories around densely populated cities. A few political revolutions and world wars later, in Western countries, the industrial age gave way to service and information-based economies, starting in 1945. And that period, 1945 to today, approximately 80 years, is where we focused our discussion earlier this season on the Mr. Homemaker podcast. But that 80 years represents less than 1.5% of our cultural history. We need to put that 1.5% in context to understand the roots of today's crisis. To begin with, let's consider human history and cultural development based on two prominent recent books. First is Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker. In this book, Pinker argues that, to quote Wikipedia, the Enlightenment values of reason, science, and humanism have brought progress, and that health, prosperity, safety, peace, and happiness have tended to rise worldwide. According to Pinker, the troubles we experience as a society and as individuals are to be blamed on religious fundamentalists on the one hand, and postmodernist skeptics on the other. Sitting in opposition to Pinker and the Enlightenment is Christopher Ryan's book, Civilized to Death. Ryan argues that the narrative of progress pushed by Enlightenment thinkers was a thinly veiled propaganda tool used to justify the assimilation and exploitation of supposedly backward societies in an age of empire building and colonialism. Not only does Ryan argue that the Enlightenment ideas undermine human flourishing, but he would go further and argue that social oppression and economic injustice, as well as various mental and physical ailments plaguing humanity for the last many centuries, exist only because we have strayed too far from our egalitarian and libertarian hunter-gatherer roots to live in a zoo that we have created ourselves ever since we adopted an agricultural way of life. By considering these two diametrically opposed narratives of human history alongside one another, we can hopefully shake ourselves awake to recognize the prevailing messages about life, family, and society that we have adopted unthinkingly may not be the only way to explain them. We need to validate our understanding of why we live the way we do and why we think the way we do, so we can proceed to designing a strategy grounded in objective truth that will lead to flourishing for ourselves, our families, and society. To kick off this phase of our journey, I'm joined by a special guest, Jared, who offers a rare and valuable combination of knowledge and thoughtfulness about history, society, and human nature. We joined the discussion as Jared and I examined the core value of individualism versus the competing core value of collectivism, and the intersection with the proper roles of family, community, and government.
Well, I mean, the whole thing, the individualism versus collectivism, I mean, this is one of the great debates in terms of political philosophy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, you have the United States, oh, we're individualistic and all of this, and then, and they say, oh, Europe's socialist, and, China's communist, and all of it. And, communist, the ideal of communism, nothing ever really lived out to that. It never does live out to the ideal because of human nature. But the ideal of communism is, everything is done sort of collectively for the body politic. But of course, that means it's done for whoever's actually in charge, right? I mean, Xi Jinping is about to be appointed to his third term and will be now the leader for life of more than 1 billion people.
Yeah.
Right?
Somehow,
he does really well. If you're low down the rungs in China, you don't do so well. So
somehow the leaders of communism always end up better off than the people under communism. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you look at it, here in the United States, we're more individualistic and you bear the consequences of your actions. And is it socialism to say, no, society is going to take care of you. If you go bankrupt, if you have a medical issue, if you just are not able to be sort of a fully functioning member of society, is society going to take care of you? Or is your family going to have to take care of you? Or are you just left on the trash heap of history as
elephants in the jungle.
Well, right. We know what they used to do, right? For disabled kids, they would put them on mountains, right? And leave them out for exposure. I mean, they talk about that in the book we read. So that doesn't seem good, right? So there's a mix of you need some social support and everything, and but you also at the same time you need to enable individual flourishing. So I don't have the answer.
Well, then what are you on the show for?
Well, right. I mean, make me king of the world, and then everybody will be happy. No, it doesn't work like that.
So, if I may observe, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but you drew a contrast between different political systems.
Yeah.
And I would want to, in addition to different political theories of how we should organize our who collects taxes, how much taxes, how do we distribute taxes,
right? Yeah.
And who gets to make those decisions. There would also just be the cultural and community dimensions too, right? Sometimes I think we aggregate these things, and they're well, there's a way of life that is typified by this time and place where the state really ran most things. And ethnic groups didn't have a lot to do with it. Family groups don't have a lot to do with it. There's a lot more individuals as subjects of the government. And then in other times and places, there wasn't a lot of formal government, and there was much more of a tribal, communal interaction, and somewhere in between you have a city-state in Italy somewhere. There's different ways that institutions that are backed up by the use of force under the government umbrella are different than we take care of people, but not through government programs. We take care of people through extended family networks, providing support to one another. And if you're broke, if we all went bankrupt, Kristen and I, one thing would be well, the government should step in to support us until we find a new job. The other thing would be well, no, our brothers and sisters and parents should step in, and the government doesn't need to do anything. And so. Elaborate on that, the distinguishing or layering on, in addition to the state, is the informal community responsibilities or lack thereof.
Well, so but then you get to questions of privilege, right? It's a privilege for me, it's a privilege for you. We have families, right? If we fell on hard times, if you or Kristen got really sick, you'd have a parent that would fly in probably to help with kids and do all this. Not everybody has that support, right? Yeah. Their parents died young, they are alienated from their parents for whatever reason. Not everyone has that same support network. And it used to be, if you look in, where we are in New England, right?
Yeah.
If you look there, 400 years ago, they would have sort of the small community in your local town or village.
Yeah.
And, if somebody was, out of luck or sick or something else, the community would pitch in. But on the other hand, if you were a stranger, you were not welcome in that community. You were, were out of luck because, okay, we've known you since childhood. You're one of us. We're going to take care of you. Versus you're a stranger. Right. No, you're weird. You're a witch. You get burned, right?
Yeah.
But so I think you get that sort of individual versus community. Another thing that's interesting to me about it is, there is a sense in a lot of places, okay, community, we want to support the community, but then, you also get this sort of individualistic, hey, I want to do what's best for me, and so how do you match what's best for you with what's best for the community? I think there's a mix, right? There's got to be a mix. I think we do have, I don't know, in my view, I think we've leaned a little forward towards the individualistic. Okay, let's keep up with the Joneses. Let's get rich. Yeah. Let's, do what we have to do. And you actually look at like donation rates, right?
Yeah.
To give to these charities, which help others, which help the community. It's actually, rich people as a share of their wealth give far less than poor people do.
Right.
To, and this goes back to the Bible, right? The widow's mite. But like, give far less than poor people do to help others in their community. I think there is that sense in certain communities of like, okay, we're going to help each other. Whereas, in other communities, like, oh yeah, you gotta turn to family, which has certain obligations to you, and it's hard to create. It's harder, I think, to create that sort of community where you really have the support, and then you need to fall. Then if people don't have the support, you need to fall to the state, or.
So I think we're in agreement.
Okay.
About several things.
Okay.
Which is particularly like the civilized to death is not it's not a policy proposal. It's not a like, here are my suggestions of like, here are the 10 things we can do to improve society. It's like a lot of very academic observations about, hey, here's how society used to be. And what some things I think are useful about that level of the conversation are, I do think he is drawing into question some assumptions we have about the way society used to be. Like maybe the life was brutish and short, cruel, brutish and short, or whatever, of like the Hobbesian
brutish and short.
The Hobbesian state of nature. Like that might be a little overhyped. It wasn't as bad as you all think it was under that worldview. And I think that's worth noting. Mm-hmm. It does not then immediately translate into and therefore here's a bunch of useful things we can do to society. Right. So we're in agreement on the limitations of it. But then the next thing is, and you actually started to go there already, is I do think it's worth noting just biologically, our bodies were not, the way my body works didn't come into existence this way since, industrial food processing, right? There's a lot of unintended side effects of having an abundance of food readily available that is mass produced and high in sodium, and there's all these kinds of things where it's be warned, everyone. You have at your disposal the means of your own self-destruction.
Right, yeah.
Because our ancestors, who you inherited your digestive tract from, did not have a grocery store down the street with all of your favorite fat content, salt contents, I think it's worth there's some cautionary tales to extract from this.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And it doesn't not immediately make me think we need more federal policies to force people to live lives and eat foods conducive to the paleo diet. But it's but we can educate people and they can make better life choices to live healthier lives,
But then again, you come to the question of, okay, well, we didn't have cigarettes and frequent. You did some tobacco, but you didn't have that.
Right.
And so, okay, you can educate people and be like, yeah, cigarettes are dangerous. They'll kill you and they'll poison your children and all this.
Right. But we also have a lot of government intervention.
But there's also a lot of government intervention that has gotten us to be where, okay, well, we tax the heck out of cigarettes, right? To make sure that they're not easy and convenient for everyone to use.
Well, and prohibitions,
even with education.
Prohibitions on advertisement. And
prohibitions on advertisement.
Tax-funded, anti-smoking campaigns.
Yeah.
So that's actually really
And significant regulations on sort of nicotine percentages and everything else. It's they're addictive chemicals, right?
So wait, I feel like you did a 180 on me. So are you advocating for a government war on salt and sugar in foods?
Well, I certainly think, if you think about it, the government subsidizes certain foods now, right? By subsidizing corn farming, for example, and subsidizing meat production and milk and dairy production and everything else. Yeah. Whereas there's, as I understand it, and I'm not a food policy expert, but as I understand it, there's not as much subsidies on, broccoli and leafy greens and other things. They don't have the same, same thing as, as big beef and big dairy and big, corn, whatever.
Yeah.
And so, government is already pushing in one direction that is maybe not a good direction for us, as a society.
Yeah.
So, maybe we want to reconsider that. And
so I have a book, I don't know if it's on the shelf here with us, but it's called Eat, Drink, and Be Healthy. Mm-hmm. And it's a couple of Harvard professors talking about their recommendations on like how they're not doing paleo stuff, but they're saying like, here's the latest research on like a healthy diet recommendations. And they spend a portion of the book talking about the history of like FDA and like, commercial food policy and like the economics of different food and growing food or raising food, that whole pipeline.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting though, do you think that case study and like how the incentive structure for like big ag or the FDA like kind of pushes foods that maybe aren't the best foods for you?
Right.
I kind of think you're arguing on the side of the anti-vaxxers who are like, I'm not so sure that I can trust everything coming out of the CDC. They might be influenced by big pharma or, how you quadruple your profits? So you say you need 4 boosters instead of 2, one shot. So, do you think that's a reasonable skepticism?
I think you can be skeptical. I think though that, you want to look, just like anything else, okay? You want to look at what the experts say. You want to look at where the experts' biases may be.
Yeah.
And you can educate yourself. For the most part, I think, the government, I don't know. Then you're getting into, is the government a force for good or evil in the world? I'm like, okay. Generally, I think a lot of people are trying to do good, but I think, obviously, the government makes mistakes. Obviously, the government screws up. Obviously, the government, is influenced by money and power, and this is flaws in the system, right?
You're shaking my world here.
Right? Yeah, no, this is par for the course. But So, but that has not, and I think over time, just like with science, right? Over time, science thought, the whole universe revolves around the Earth, and then over time you can say, okay, well, no, you have a new worldview, and then you prove it, and then. But it's not proven, right? There's no proof. It's okay. We have a hypothesis, and we check it, and this matches all of our hypotheses, and then we further develop things over time. But again, I think the same way with policies and with our understanding of ourselves, of our brains, of our bodies, all of this. It changes and goes over time, and we need to keep up with that and try and not let the biases and the individualism of the big ag executives that would love to, influence us. But
that's so funny.
You do the best you can.
Okay, so.
But I have a question for you though. This gets a little bit back, because I think I don't know if I remember if I heard the episode you did, but the 1950s is this like golden era, right?
No. And then it's the beginning of the end.
But the beginning of the end, but at 1950 we were great, and then we're downhill, or how's that?
The way I would break it down is, if you're a member of the greatest generation, you're the last generation who was raised well, and then you became an adult and you messed everything up, because you didn't think through.
So when were they were raised? What, in the 30s?
Again, you asked me. This is a great question. I don't have my cheat sheet in front of me. So no, they're everybody who was born from 1900 to 1915.
Oh, okay.
So that's like pre-World War I, World War II.
So Teddy Roosevelt, the height, that was when things
he
were
was
great.
Raised the best. But then he that whole generation between like arrogant intellectualism and your everyday man on the street who's like, hey, this whole like fighting World War II thing, I kind of feel like I got like some time chilling coming to me. I'd like to sort of take a breather for the next few decades. Including, like, I want to have my own little house where people kind of leave me alone. All that whole thing of let's move out to the suburbs and everybody gets their own house, which again, there's a lot of government policy and subsidization that went into that as well. But that whole transition, that was all bad. The people who were making those decisions were raised well, and they just exercised poor judgment.
Yeah.
But then their children, the boomers, and also the silent generation is kind of half and half there of like, actors in those decision makers versus like people who were subject to that decision making. But anyway, those people were raised terribly. And so it's not their fault at all. They went on to do even worse things, but you kind of gotta give them like, well, you were really set up for failure. because life as a child in a 1950s house, I think, was really bad.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the depiction of it is like trying to highlight all of the goodness. Like, oh, the kids are riding their bikes in the street and everybody's friends with the across the... If the reason is because their parents grew up back in an environment where they were very familiar with their extended family and community. Mm-hmm. They had they were beneficiaries of multiple generations of community cohesion. And so they already had this program of like, part of life is you trust your neighbors and you help them shovel their driveway and you do. And like, so that the greatest generation living out the lessons they learned in their childhood in the 1950s, they were doing okay. Mm-hmm. But they didn't realize they were setting their children up for failure, the boomers. So I think that was the beginning of the end. I am against the 1950s lifestyle. I am in favor of the pre-World War I, pre-Industrial Revolution lifestyle.
So Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, talks about how sort of, things have gotten better, better education, less violence, fewer wars. I mean, the time period you're talking about when they were kids, when the greatest generation were kids, we had this little thing called the Great War. WW1, but it was only relabeled that after WW2 happened, and they laid the groundwork for it. But thousands of people were dying. Millions of people died in World War One. You have all this violence. You have all this stuff.
I think that's the result. That isn't the result of family and community lifestyle. World War One was not like, well, that's what happens when you have people living with their parents. Or like in the communities they grew up in.
Well, no.
World War One flows. World War One is the natural consequence of global industrialization.
Yeah.
So I think again so when you're going to what's the causal chain? Who and what is to blame? What's to blame is industrialization, and I think the movement from an agriculture-based society to an industrial-based society is the next big watershed. And in the way Civilized to Death.
So we go back a century, and you get the Napoleonic Wars.
Yes.
So what was... That's pre-industrialization.
Civilized warfare. We're going to line up. We're going to take turns shooting at each other. It's just a massive duel like you'd have in the streets. Like civilized
they had them in the streets too.
Which is, I'm for that too. Bring them back.
Dueling in the streets.
No, but again, it's like the paleo thing. It's like, it is useful to know what people ate before agriculture because that's how our bodies evolved.
Yeah.
And it's useful to know in a very parallel way how society was organized post hunter-gatherer. 94.5% of it was in an agricultural world, not an industrial world.
Okay.
And so in the same way that I have this like pet hypothesis of like, we should be more thoughtful about how our biology and even like our evolutionary instinctive behaviors, like the way your brain is wired, your ability to have 150 close contacts, that you can trace the source of that back to, 99.5% of our human evolution, or whatever it was, is based in that hunter-gatherer world. Mm-hmm. By that same logic, 94% of all cultural development has been in an agricultural world. And so I have a secondary pet hypothesis of like, we should be more deferential to the way of life we think of associated with agriculture, and less scornful.
So more serfdom.
Yeah, well, that's one form of an agriculture-based society. Yes,
that's a significant form that was used for thousands of years.
Serfdom and feudalism, but also like Jeffersonian visions of like everybody had
the independent farmer,
right?
But that only comes about from the Enlightenment.
Well, and it comes about when you have plenty of land for free.
Well, right, that too.
An abundance of land that you can, which at that time in America, like, hey, we've got a frontier. Every person can just go a little bit further west, plot out some land. That's your farm. We can do that forever. Yeah. If you're Jefferson. So the way we organize society, we only have 5% of the history that we've had a society beyond a hunter-gatherer tribe. Mm-hmm. Only 5% of it have we been in a post-agricultural state. And that's just in terms of our scope and scale of experience.
Oh, yeah. No,
lessons
absolutely.
learned. I think it gives me pause. I'm like, we don't actually have a lot of experience in human history understanding how to do this well. No. Living in cities and having communities revolve around industry and commercial interests rather than for 95% of it, it was like, well, no, I'm a sustenance farmer. And any surplus, I give you some and you give me some candlesticks. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm not good at making candlesticks. Here's a chicken. You know,
I mean, I'll push back a little bit on that.
Yeah,
We had, you know, Rome, for example, was more than 1 million people 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? And the way they did that was they had teams of slaves. I mean, it wasn't so much feudalism and serfdom, but they had, you know, they would conquer areas and use the agricultural, you know, surplus to feed Rome, right? They would ship wheat to Rome and they had 1 million people. It wasn't after Rome fell. It wasn't for another 1,000 years before there was a city of more than 1 million people.
So I wonder what that pie chart looks like. Like, what percentage of the population during the height of the Roman Empire, what percentage of the population lived in an urban center versus lived in a countryside? I have no idea.
I think it's still the vast majority in the countryside because, I mean, until you get modern farming technology, not modern, but, you know, until you get more advanced farming technology where, you know, you don't need, it's not as labor intensive. I mean, that's the thing that changed it from, you know, 80% of the country or whatever, 80% of the people need to work on the farm to supply, and they can supply food for themselves and the other 20%, to nowadays we live in a society where, you know, 1 to 3% of the population works on the farm and feeds the rest of society. Right? I mean, we sort of, these noble farmers, like, they're a tiny percentage of the population these days compared to what they were. And it used to be that you see this in, you know, in other places too, where you get like subsistence farming. You have in some societies where people are really just feeding themselves from the land on a subsistence basis, and it's tough. Whereas we now have, you know, sort of giant industrial concerns where one guy on a massive, you know, harvester can you know, handle, you know, acres and acres and acres. It would have
taken hundreds of people to do in the past, for sure.
Yeah.
Let us pause for a moment to extend our sincere appreciation to those who make the Mr. Homemaker podcast possible.
Thank you to our patrons who make Mr. Homemaker possible, particularly Barbara, Ted, and Heather. Thanks to your support, Mr. Homemaker has donated to Mary's Place of Seattle, Washington, with a vision of community where all families have safety, stability, and housing, and a mission to ensure that no child sleeps outside. To help us reach more couples trying to navigate these challenging times, please like, subscribe, and share this podcast or YouTube channel with your significant other, relatives, and friends.
The discussion is about to resume. Please take your seats and give your attention.
I think that, you know, it gives me pause to reflect on how brief our experience is in a post-agricultural and industrialized world.
Yeah.
And then you add to that our cultural experience in a post-industrial world, or, you know, basically they consider the contemporary period, the end of World War II to present day, 80 years. So that is 1.5% of our post-hunter-gatherer experience as a species.
Well, and it's one lifetime. I mean, you think about how, and I get it. I mean, there are, you know, this is part of the reason why I think certain factions in society push back. It's like, things are changing too fast.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, like...
Do you not think that is a fast change? That, like, the changes we've made in the last 1.5% of our...
Oh, absolutely. No, there's huge... I mean, the changes are coming very quickly and rapidly. And I understand the dissonance in, like, I grew up differently. I mean, my mom grew up in a time, she was the first generation where women, you know, on a large scale could have professional jobs.
Sure.
And we now live in a society where women can have absolutely professional jobs and do. And you know, there's more women now going to college than men, which for all of human history, that never happened before, right? And so I think we've seen, and not just with that, I mean, you see it with, you know, obviously with the internet and with all the technology and everything, that, you know, the advances we've made in part, you know, we've organized our society towards sort of progress and science and that, and not, you know, for 1,000 years after Rome, you see, I mean, yes, there were advances and it's not the Dark Ages, but I mean, they weren't that dark, but like, you don't see a huge amount of advances, and you saw a regression from, the heights of Rome and Roman engineering and Roman culture and everything.
Yeah.
And you see that sort of what earlier historians referred to as the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the ages between Rome and then the Enlightenment, where...
Well, I think the label of the Dark Ages was an Enlightenment, propaganda against that time period.
I guess that time period.
Yeah.
But I mean, there was not... there were not leaps and bounds technologically, whereas, starting with the Enlightenment, and you get Erasmus and sort of an investment in education and in science and in the development of sort of science as a background there, you start seeing over the last 500 years tremendous progress, right?
Yeah.
And industrialization and everything. And we're still, according to Pinker, we're still benefiting from that.
Yeah.
I understand that there are people that are like, wait a minute, things have changed so fast. I mean, even when we were growing up, right?
Well,
things have changed significantly since we were growing up.
Absolutely.
I grew up at a time before the internet, before cell phones, before all of this. Things have changed rapidly. Mm-hmm. And so there is, there's a dissonance in like, okay, well, yes, they've changed rapidly, but, what have we lost? What have we gained?
Yeah. Well, in my version of the hypothesis on that front is it's not change is bad, we should be changing. But it's more, I worry that the prevailing impulse, like there's a minority of people who are like, things are changing, I'm uncomfortable.
Yeah.
They're not the majority. It's not that, most people are saying things are changing too. Most people are, I worry, unthinkingly just going with the flow.
Yeah.
Like, which can sometimes mean you're going with the flow over the waterfall, through the white water, through the rapids. And it's just, I think people get excited, like early adopter types and, innovators and economic interests promote the benefits of things.
Yeah.
And maybe don't speak as loudly or clearly, the print gets a little smaller and you're like, there's also downsides. And have we really thought through the downsides, just like each of these transitions, as more food becomes available, there's a downside to that.
Yeah.
We have an obesity problem around here.
Right.
And so which doesn't mean that we shouldn't make food available, but it means as we do that, we should also mitigate the downside. We need to mitigate against the risk that we're going to have an obesity crisis in our country. Mm-hmm. How are we going to address that while we continue to make food available? So it's not a binary, either turn the clock back or blindly, blunder forward into the unknown, but it's how can we more circumspectly navigate each transition? That's sort of what I worry about.
Yeah.
But so even that sort of 10,000 foot survey of those milestones before and through the Enlightenment, one of the critiques, the critical reviews of Pinker's book, written in the Washington Post, they talk about how the concept of progress and the idea that the arc of history is long but it bends toward justice, that idea,
Martin Luther King.
Yeah. But you could trace that idea back to the Enlightenment itself.
Yeah.
And basically the Enlightenment simultaneously promoted the idea of progress, the policies of we should be promoting these changes, and in order to justify that, so here's a way to think about history, is that we are in this process of progressing.
Yeah.
And so change is intrinsically good, and we'll worry about the downsides later. That is an Enlightenment idea. Mm-hmm. And she, this author, this journalist, contrasts that with basically saying she identifies 4 ways to look at the world. One is through the lens of the Enlightenment, saying progress is intrinsically good, we'll worry about the downsides later. Mm-hmm. The second worldview that the Enlightenment thinkers were in competition with at the time was the Jewish and Christian Old Testament worldview of history is defined by the fallen, flawed nature of human beings, and God is constantly in the process of trying to pull us out of our own blunders so that we can conform our lifestyle better to the way he meant for us to live our lives. Mm-hmm. Which would basically be most of our impulses to change things are bad. Usually we're wrong, and we should really be reluctant to buck the system, because we're more likely to be wrong than right, like, as the competition, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Enlightenment thinkers were like, no, we reject that. We think most progress is good. And then the second school of thought that they were rebelling against was the more, I don't think they would have called it this, but like a secular worldview of like empires and societies rise and fall. And like, this is just the inevitable cycle of first came the Greeks and then they fell, and then came the Roman Empire and then it fell. And now we have European feudalism and that will fall. And like, they were just saying like, yep, this is just the cycle of humanity. And it's sort of almost like a nihilistic, like it doesn't really mean anything. It's not going anywhere. Do you think that the Enlightenment thought is more accurate than those alternatives? Or you think like, well, no, those are just three different ways to view the world and none of them is superior or more accurate than another?
I don't think those three ways of viewing the world, or at least, and I'll clarify, but are in conflict. I think you can think, okay, for example, there was the Roman Empire, there was the Greeks, and they rose and they fell. But we got democracy from the Greeks. We got the idea of democracy from the Greeks, right? They fall, but we kept things. With the Romans, we got, certain, advances. Right, and you got certain advances, certain developments from the Romans. And yes, for a long time, sort of people didn't focus on that, but then in the Enlightenment, the idea was not so much continuous progress. It was, we're going to rediscover what we knew in the past and build on it. And so, the British Empire, huge empire, quarter of the world, rose, fell. And now they're, a little island in the middle of the North Atlantic, not there, towards Europe, But like, no, I mean, the British Empire rose and fell, but we still benefit from some of the developments they brought us. And we still have huge detriments from some of the many horrible things that they did around the world.
So I think in this, even Pinker says this, although I think one of the literary critics calls him out for not following his own advice. But he makes the point of, we don't have to treat everything as a bundle of these things are inextricably intertwined. We can decouple how we organize certain aspects of the economy from how we organize certain aspects of society. And or those two things are not entirely dependent upon which political party is setting the policy. We can toggle these different switches independently. And so it would be possible, particularly in a internet-enabled remote work information economy, at least for people who have positioned themselves to do that kind of work. It'd be possible to be let's just all go back to the everybody figure out where your great-grandparents lived, go back there. And whatever you want to do, you can still do it from there. But instead of the government intervention to be the social safety net, you're going to be with your siblings and cousins. You guys work it out. I mean, I'm not saying that we should do that.
As an only child,
I'm not saying we should do that, but I'm saying those things are independent sets of choices, Given the Enlightenment emphasis on science and evidence and rational thought, questioning received wisdom and those kinds of things, and given the recent history, the last 1.5% of human history, the post-World War II era, I am curious, and I'd like you to speak on behalf of all Enlightenment thinkers throughout time and place.
Yes.
How much data would we need to prove the way of life we've adopted post-World War II is worse for people? People are less well off in terms of, insert thing here, right? There's data on the graphs of the rates of, sort of where this conversation started months ago, rates of divorce go up, rates of cohabitation go up, rates of fatherless children go up, time parents spend with their children goes down. People's, all of these are quantifiable and unchallenged. All the graphs say bad things on the rise. Now Pinker would say, well, but also we have more vaccines. And then Civilized to Death would say, yeah, but we only need these vaccines because you keep packing people into these tightly, dense population centers. You're creating a problem and then giving me a partial solution and asking me to say thank you. And the hunter-gatherer is I resent you forcing this way of life on me and then wanting me to say thanks. But even on Pinker's and the Enlightenment thinkers' own terms, there should be some point at which we're well, we can gather enough evidence to acknowledge, yes, there are significant downsides to the way we're living now. And like the Enlightenment thinkers said, hey, instead of this whole feudalism thing, we should go back to a more Roman citizen model of like fewer classes and more egalitarianism, right? Like they were going back, they weren't inventing something new. And similarly, we could say today, yeah, we kind of got out ahead of our skis on this whole like despecialize and focus on careers and individualism. And we've really lost a lot of the benefits of community and family. And we should go back, we should have another renaissance of those agricultural lifestyles and principles, bring those up into the current day. And we don't have to give up the internet to embrace being closer to family, geographically or in terms of hours in the day. Right? More people can work from home like people did in agricultural times. It was only the industrial period that we said, oh, well, you have to be away from your family for 40 to 60 hours a week. Mm-hmm. That wasn't part of agricultural life. You did agriculture with your family at your house. And so do you think do you think that is possible? Do you think that that would be good? Do you think that that is a valid parallel to draw between bringing back those things that were shown to work in the past that we have lost, like democracy? We lost it. Let's bring that back. Mm-hmm. Agricultural family and community ties, that worked. We've lost that. We could bring that back.
So I think, here's the problem with the question, the way it's framed, right?
Yeah, please.
Is that you're saying, oh, well, is life better or worse? Well, science doesn't say better or worse,
yeah,
right? For human flourishing, we have to, Pinker obviously says, okay, well, look at life expectancy has improved. That is better. Education we view as a good thing. That has improved. That is better.
Yeah.
But he is making a value judgment based on things, and you're absolutely right. I mean, so and better or worse is a trade-off, right? I mean, there are trade-offs, like the divorce rate. The divorce rate has gone up.
Yeah.
We could bring the divorce rate to zero by simply prohibiting all divorce.
Yeah.
Now, mind you,
that would have downsides too.
That would have downsides too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and there would be significant downsides and all the rest. But whatever we want to focus on, and I think generally the best way I think of running a society is like you pick what you want to focus on as a society, like problems and issues you want to focus on, and then you try to solve those problems. So if the issue is not enough jobs, well, let's promote industry or whatever, promote economic growth. I mean, there's lots of things like that. If you are trying to deal with the opioid epidemic, okay, what are the ways we can go, which is obviously a horrible thing, what are the ways that we know that are effective in dealing with that? And I think that's what, the Enlightenment and rationalism can help us with, is if there's a problem that we're trying to solve, what are the effective ways of trying to solve that? Rather than, oh, well, we've embraced progress and so we've lost something. I mean, life has changed.
Yeah.
And life has changed to be immeasurably better in certain ways, but also worse in certain ways. Yeah. And we've lost certain things. And so how do we, with modern life, sort of bring it back to that? And I'll give you an example. 100 years ago, the Vanderbilts in Tennessee, they had, and they built a huge mansion in Tennessee, and they were one of the only people or more than 100 years ago now, they were one of the only people in the country to have an automobile, right? That they would drive around. Now, not anyone, but a huge number of people drive automobile, and the poor guy was walking in horrible shoes that may have been months or years out of date through the mud to get wherever he was going. Nowadays, even poor people can have cars and automobiles and public transportation and refrigerators. Yeah. So yes, have we lost something there? From going from this agricultural society? Yeah, maybe we've lost some of the connection and the human connection, and I think we can absolutely say we want to prioritize that, and we want to build stronger communities, like Bowling Alone and Putnam. Yeah. We need to rebuild those strong communities because, through the internet and through social media and all the rest, we've sort of, divided from one another and in a way, and we need to build stronger communities together. Absolutely. I agree with that. But at the same time, has life, to my mind, gotten better than, walking shoeless through the mud in Tennessee to go farm somebody else's land as a sharecropper? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. For almost everyone. So
maybe this will be like the final thought, because I know you have other appointments. But so since as you just said, right, like science, although I think that the Enlightenment more broadly and like humanism does purport to offer a framework for developing like the judgments of what are our value judgments, what things are worthy and what things are less worthy of what should be our goals for a society.
Right, yeah. Let me put this on you, though, that, so, if you want to live, if you chose, when you married Kristen and had kids, you chose not to move back to where your family was and to farm and to be agricultural. You chose to do something different, right?
Yeah.
And certainly, I mean, there's plenty of people in society that, like, they... if they grow up in a small town, they stay there. Even in our town, there's plenty of people who they're 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 10th generation in town.
Yeah.
They've never left. Their family is here. They never want to leave. And, they find some career that they can do, where they stay close to family, whether that's agricultural or not. But, there's plenty of people that do that. And then there's other people that, they move away. Yeah. They try, I think people try to create better lives for themselves when they do that. I mean, you guys chose to make a life for yourself independent from where your families are. Why did you do that to push back on the argument? I mean, you've chosen not to do that. If that was the ideal, then why have you chosen to go against the ideal?
Because I hadn't thought it all the way through. I didn't fully understand the consequences of the decisions I was making.
Well, fair enough.
Right. So I was like,
we rarely do.
I am learning some hard lessons. I should make a podcast about this. Warn others against some of the choices. Yeah. I think there are costs and downsides, and Kristen would agree. She would be less vehement about it than I would, but she's like, being away from family is a lot harder than I thought it would be.
Especially with kids,
And so she has a sister who, with kids just a couple of years younger than our kids, who lives 10 minutes from her parents, and they're light, and 10 minutes from his parents. Like, they're in a little triangle of, like, they are in a nebula of extended family and close relatives.
Which makes a huge difference.
And even people I worked with before I became Mr. Homemaker, a lot of them sustained the lifestyle demanded by that job because my neighbor's my mom. If I don't make it home from work to pick up the kids, my mom picks them up.
Right.
I don't need to hire a sitter and give them a car. I have to buy a second car so that the sitter can use my car, which is like a thing we were considering.
Yeah.
Before we're like, this is not going to work. Yeah. And so, do as I say, not as I do. Not because I knew with eyes wide open, this is how this is going to play out, and I think it was worth it. But I'm telling people to do something different. I'd rather it's I had no idea how this was going to play out, and now that I've seen it's playing out, I'm like, I would reconsider a lot of these choices. But it's also a lot harder to, once you've committed to a course of action, to change that course of action. It'd be hard for me at this age to be like, Kristen, I'm going to learn how to farm. And we're going to uproot our family.
Or hunt and gather.
That's a lot harder to do than if you're 18 to 25. And you're like, hey, before I make decisions about how much student loans to take out and how long to postpone settling down and how to approach married life with my future spouse, I can think about, informed by life lessons from Mr. Homemaker. How does that play out? What are the pros and cons of that? But my sense is that we haven't adopted across society a humanism the way across society we have adopted empiricism. I think science and empirical thought and the dominance of I need data and an experiment to prove this to me, I think that prevails today. I don't think that a coherent set of principles about human nature and human flourishing, as embodied in the Declaration of Independence. Mm-hmm. I think today most people, many people, especially on Reddit, most people would like intuitively reject those principles and the underlying philosophy. They would say, no, I don't, from the Enlightenment, I do adopt the idea that science is good. I reject the idea that we can rationally agree on like an ethical and moral and value framework as a society. I think, again, the individualism has taken people past that idea to the idea of I am the sole arbiter of values and morals and ethics for myself and my world. I get to create my own moral universe. Each of us do. Do you think that is there a path to pulling us back from that? Do you think I'm right? Do you think that is true, that we've over-indexed on a rejection of objective reality and moral truths, and even from a humanistic perspective, not necessarily a theological based thing, but we've over-indexed on individual subjectivism, a subjectivist worldview? And do you think there's a path out of that?
You know, it's interesting what you say, and it's just like one of the things I've sort of noticed and thought about is that we currently live in a society that is it's a little more cynical, I think, than our parents or our grandparents or if you look further back. Yeah. And I mean, maybe that's just I live in this society, and there was cynicism and like anti-government and disbelief and whatever. But like I think we live in a society where it's hard. It's hard to sort of trust
to build consensus,
each other and build consensus, and in a way that it didn't. I mean, and obviously there were disagreements in history and all this, but yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that you need trying to set up. I do think that there's still a cultural backdrop of certain things that are acceptable and not acceptable, and that changes over time, and things get added to it. Like we were talking before this about the sort of the racism issue with the LA City Council, and certain things that backroom racist complaints about coworkers was done for generations, but now it is not acceptable, and people are now more microphones are around as well. But like
you're saying, there is consensus around some values and norms,
and society develops a consensus. And that consensus changes over time, but society develops a consensus around certain values and norms, and I think that is still happening. Now, mind you, does that mean that we have the right consensus around the right values and norms? I mean, I can certainly, like I said, I'm concerned that we are in a very cynical time period, and that it is difficult to develop, I think, a national or global consensus on certain things. More difficult now than it was before, in part because media is all over the place. But
and the globalism might be part of it too, which again might be a show unto itself. But like, it's harder to build a consensus when you are able to exchange information with people globally instantly. Yeah, it's easier to build a consensus when there's 150 people who you share life with, and like you guys build a community. Right.
Yeah, no, absolutely, but I look forward. I want to see your book on the humanist principles we should all adopt, and build that groundswell. I mean because I don't, I think a lot of people don't even think about this stuff, and you go about and you try and do the best you can.
I mean, I don't think I'm the best advocate for humanism, but I do think that what I like about humanism, and I think like it's sort of frustrating that. Again, some things adopted, some things rejected. When I think they were sort of a cohesive set of the Enlightenment thinkers saying, we were constrained by received wisdom that included like certain moral principles and laws and so on. We want to reevaluate those. Mm-hmm. The way we propose doing that is through like a system or a paradigm of rational thought. But that system of like people being trained and like literate in avoiding cognitive biases and embracing like formal logic and understanding that if A then B doesn't mean that if not A not B. Like people, I think all of that has been lost. But that was part of how people made the transition from the medieval period to the Enlightenment period, was like, we can still do this. We can question and push back against the received wisdom because we have a system for doing it in a rational way that we can all agree to. But then we lost that system. And so we've rejected the traditional received wisdom, and we have no collective sense of how to navigate these things.
Well, but it was never quite as collective as that. I mean,
well, no, it was the intellectual elites. Yeah. But I mean, even among today's intellectual elites, I don't think they have a shared paradigm about how the process, the methodology, the principles to apply to navigate the questions. I worry about that.
Yeah.
And so whether it's humanism or something else, the book I would write would be less about like, a partner to Pinker's book and be more like I don't know. I think the closest thing to that in popular culture today is there's a groundswell of popular level books trying to promote Stoicism.
Yeah.
I will hyperlink to some of those in the show notes below.
Oh.
I don't remember them offhand. I have one of them. There's like the Daily Stoic. And
so going back to the Greeks,
Ryan Holiday. Yeah, but he's trying to promote like, here is a way to think. And that's what I fear we've lost, that I think it becomes a vicious cycle that accelerates individualism and makes it harder and harder to create consensus and community, is because we are seemingly accelerating down the path of like, well, there is no reality, there's no objective truth, there's no norm to which we have to conform. Each of us just gets to create it all on our own. And so even if it is Stoicism or it's humanism, I think it would be a step in the right direction for us to acknowledge as a species, as a civilization, as a nation, as a community, like, no, it's better if we're not all just living in a universe of our own invention. Like, it's better for us to be in a community where we have shared values, even if that doesn't tell us what those values should be.
Well, and the real danger there is, and one of the real dangers in our country as a whole is that people are limiting themselves to people with shared values.
Right.
Like, right. I'm forming my community, and I'm only going to engage with like-minded individuals.
People who already agree with whatever my arbitrary point of view is.
Where, when it was, it's like, okay, well, I mean, there was part of that, but it was not so self-selecting when it was
you had to
a rural community, right?
Yeah.
You had to interact with the crazy guy down the lane because he's your neighbor, right? And so, you sort of, and it wasn't so much, okay, well, hey, like-minded or not. It's like, okay, you form a community with the people around you and try and engage with them, and
Yeah. Well, I think we flagged several things that we'll get to come back to when we have it back. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you for being on.
Thanks so much.
That's all the time we have for today. For additional and behind-the-scenes content, follow and engage with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon. And please share your thoughts on YouTube, Reddit, or at mr-homemaker.com about how to further evaluate and integrate human history and cultural development as we develop strategies for men today to have healthy, fulfilling marriages and family lives. Until next time, happy homemaking.
Thank you so much for attending today's discussion with Mr. Homemaker. Please take this opportunity to subscribe, like, and share this episode with your spouse, relatives, and friends. We further invite you to access complimentary information and resources at our website, mr-homemaker.com. There you will also find links to join the discussion via email or social media. And please, support the Mr. Homemaker podcast and receive merchandise and membership benefits on patreon.com. Until next time, farewell.